He was just a father trying to get his daughter to a new life with the last of his money and a tank of gas, but when his truck broke down in a storm, they were rescued by a woman living in a hidden mansion who had everything she ever wanted except a reason to feel alive. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The fog had been clinging to the mountain roads for hours, a thick, soupy gray that blurred the line between the asphalt and the abyss. It swallowed the tops of the pine trees, muffled the sound of the world, and made the inside of Leo's old pickup truck feel like the last safe place on earth. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the 10 feet of visible road ahead. The engine, a tired and loyal friend, sputtered a quiet protest every time he downshifted for another hairpin turn. Beside him, his daughter Maya was a small, warm bundle of trust, her head leaning against the passenger window, her breath fogging a small circle on the glass. She was 8 years old, with eyes that held the quiet wisdom of someone who had learned to read the weather in her father's silence. She wasn't scared. In fact, she seemed to find the whole ordeal a grand adventure, a journey into a secret, cloud-wrapped kingdom. Leo wished he shared her optimism. The truth was, they were running on fumes, both in the gas tank and in his spirit. The last of their savings was a crumpled wad of bills in his wallet, earmarked for the first month's rent on an apartment he'd only seen in grainy photos, and the deposit on a job that was a promise, not a guarantee. Leaving their old life behind hadn't been a choice. It had been a necessity, a slow and painful amputation after the factory closed and the town began to hollow out from the inside. He'd packed their life into this: truck tools, clothes, a box of Maya's books, and the small, hand-carved wooden robin he'd made for her last birthday. Everything else was gone. The truck coughed again, a more violent, rattling sound this time. Leo's stomach tightened. He tapped the gas pedal, coaxing, pleading. The engine responded with a final, shuddering gasp before falling silent. The truck coasted for another 20 feet, its tires whispering against the wet road, before rolling to a stop on the narrow shoulder. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the soft drumming of rain against the roof and the low sigh of the wind in the unseen trees. Maya sat up, her breath still misting the window. "Did we break?" she asked, her voice small but not afraid. Leo closed his eyes for a single, long second, letting the weight of it all settle in his chest. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "I think we broke." He looked at the gas gauge, the needle resting firmly on empty. He'd miscalculated, pushed their luck one mountain pass too far. He ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble scratching his palm. He was a carpenter, a man who built things, fixed things. It was all he knew. And here he was, stranded, with his daughter watching him, waiting for him to fix this. But some things couldn't be fixed with a wrench and a steady hand. He took a deep breath, the air cold and damp, and turned to her. "Well," he said, mustering a smile. "Looks like we're camping in a cloud tonight." Maya's eyes lit up. For real? That was the magic of her, the unwavering belief that even this, their lowest point, could be a story worth telling. He just hoped it would have a good ending. The world outside the truck was a hostile whisper of cold and wet. Leo pulled on his worn work jacket, the fabric thin at the elbows, and zipped it to his chin. The air that hit him as he stepped out was sharp, biting, smelling of damp earth and pine. The fog was so dense he could barely see the front of his own truck. They were utterly, completely alone. Or so he thought. He walked the perimeter of the vehicle, hands in his pockets, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, muddy shoulder. He checked his phone. No signal. Of course. Mountains were good at keeping secrets, and right now they were keeping him and Maya locked in a silent, gray embrace. He leaned against the truck's tailgate, the cold metal seeping through his jeans, and let out a long, slow breath. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Fear was a fire he had to keep banked for Maya's sake. He had to think. They had water, a few granola bars, and 2 blankets in the back. They could last the night. Someone would eventually drive by. A park ranger, a logger. anyone. They just had to wait. "Dad?" Maya's voice called from the cracked open window. "I see a light." Leo straightened, squinting into the gloom. He saw nothing but the swirling fog. "Where, honey?" "Over there," she said, pointing a small finger through the trees, off the road, into the dense woods. "It blinks." He followed her gaze, and for a moment he still saw nothing. Then, just as he was about to dismiss it as a trick of the fog, he saw it. A single, soft point of yellow light, appearing and disappearing between the thick trunks of the pines. It wasn't a headlight. It was too steady, too warm. It was a window, a house. Out here, in the middle of nowhere? It seemed impossible. But it was there. A flicker of hope, faint but real, sparked in his chest. It was a risk. Plunging into the woods on a deserted mountain road was the kind of thing that started horror movies. But staying here, waiting for a miracle that might not come, felt like a greater risk. He looked back at Maya, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and faith in him. He made a decision. "All right, kiddo," he said, his voice stronger now. "Grab your bird. Looks like we're going for a little hike." He helped her out of the truck, her small hand finding his instantly. He grabbed a flashlight and the emergency blanket, slinging it over his shoulder. Together, they left the safety of the truck and stepped into the woods, moving toward the blinking light, a single point of fragile hope in a world that had gone gray. The ground beneath their feet was a treacherous carpet of wet leaves and slick roots. The fog wrapped around them, muffling their footsteps, making the world feel intimate and immense at the same time. Leo kept the flashlight beam aimed low, illuminating a small patch of earth in front of them, a moving circle of safety in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Maya held his hand tightly, her other hand clutching the little wooden robin in her coat pocket. She didn't speak, but he could feel her trust, a steady warmth against his palm. The light grew stronger as they walked, less of a blink and more of a steady glow. It was coming from somewhere up ahead, higher on the slope. Soon, the uneven forest floor gave way to something smoother, flatter, gravel. They had found a driveway. It was unmarked, a narrow ribbon of dark stone that snaked up into the woods, looking as if it had been carved from the mountain itself. It was meticulously maintained, no weeds, no potholes. This wasn't some hunter's cabin. This was something else. They followed it for what felt like a mile, the incline growing steeper. The air grew stiller, the sounds of the forest fading as if they were entering a different realm. And then the trees parted, and they stopped. Leo's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of glass and steel, a stunning, hypermodern structure that seemed to grow out of the mountainside. Walls of floor-to-ceiling windows were framed in dark, polished metal. Sharp angles and clean lines defined a building that was both a masterpiece of architecture and a stark intrusion on the wild landscape. It was beautiful and cold, a silent, glowing monolith in the heart of the fog. "Wow," Maya whispered, her voice full of awe. "It's a castle." It did look like a castle, Leo thought. A lonely one. Every light was on, bathing the surrounding woods in a soft, ethereal glow, but there were no sounds, no signs of life. No car in the driveway, no smoke from the chimney. It felt empty, a magnificent shell waiting for someone to come home. He hesitated at the edge of the manicured lawn. This was a world away from his own. The people who lived in a place like this didn't welcome stranded strangers with muddy boots and worried eyes. They had gates, security systems, and a healthy suspicion of anyone who wasn't on an approved list. But turning back now, into the cold, dark woods, felt impossible. The warmth from those windows was a siren call. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and led Maya toward the front door, a massive slab of dark wood that looked more like a bank vault than an entrance. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles could touch the surface, the door swung inward, silent and smooth. A woman stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the bright, warm light from within. She was tall, slender, her posture ramrod straight. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot, and she wore a simple, cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored black trousers. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, not standing on a remote mountaintop. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and completely unreadable. Her eyes, a startling shade of ice blue, swept over them, taking in his worn jacket, his muddy boots, Maya's small, upturned face. She didn't look scared or angry. She looked annoyed, like they were an inconvenient stain on her perfect, sterile world. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice was as cool and polished as the steel beams of her house. It held no warmth, no welcome. It was a barrier, a dismissal delivered in 3 simple, cutting words. Leo felt a familiar wave of shame and anger wash over him. He instinctively pulled Maya a little closer, shielding her from the woman's cold gaze. He'd felt this look before from bank loan officers, from landlords, from anyone in a position of power looking down at a man who had less. He cleared his throat, forcing his own voice to remain steady. "Our truck broke down," he said, gesturing vaguely back toward the road. "Saw your light. We need to wait out the storm. Maybe use a phone if you have one." The woman's expression didn't change. She stared at him for a long moment, her silence a form of judgment. Leo could feel Maya fidgeting beside him, her small hand gripping his tighter. The hope that had carried them through the woods was rapidly dissolving under this woman's icy scrutiny. He was about to turn away, to apologize for bothering her and retreat back into the cold, when Maya, with the unfiltered courage of a child, stepped forward. She held up her wooden robin, its painted eye looking up at the woman. "My dad made him," she said, her voice clear and bright. "He can fix things, even trucks, but not when they're out of gas." The woman's gaze dropped to the small carved bird in Maya's hand. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her features. It wasn't pity, it was something else. Surprise, maybe. Her eyes, when they lifted back to Leo's, had lost some of their sharpness. The hard line of her mouth softened, just a fraction. She looked from Maya's earnest face to Leo's guarded one, and then she let out a slow, quiet breath, like a fortress lowering its drawbridge one reluctant inch at a time. "The storm is getting worse," she said, her tone still cool, but no longer dismissive. "You should come inside." She stepped back, holding the door open. It wasn't a warm invitation, but it was an offer of sanctuary. And for now, that was more than enough. The inside of the house was even more breathtaking and intimidating than the outside. The foyer opened up into a vast, 2-story living space with a wall of glass that looked out onto the fog-shrouded valley. The furniture was minimalist and modern: a sleek leather couch, a glass coffee table, a single, starkly beautiful sculpture in the corner. The floors were polished concrete, and the air smelled of nothing at all, a clean, sterile scent that was the opposite of a home. It was a gallery, a museum, a place designed to be looked at, not lived in. Leo wiped his boots on the mat, feeling as though his very presence might tarnish the pristine environment. Maya, on the other hand, just tilted her head back, her mouth a small O of wonder. "It's like being inside a diamond," she whispered. The woman, who had yet to give her name, closed the door behind them. The sound was a soft, final click that sealed them inside, shutting out the storm. "You can leave your jackets here," she said, gesturing to a closet that seemed to appear out of a seamless wall. Leo helped Maya out of her coat, then shrugged off his own. Underneath, his flannel shirt felt rough and out of place. He was acutely aware of the small tear near the cuff, the faded color, the way it clung to his frame. He was a man of sawdust and calluses, in a world of cashmere and clean lines. "I'm Serafina," the woman said finally. Her voice was still measured, but the edge had softened. "You can call me Sira." "Leo," he said, extending a hand out of habit before realizing his were probably still damp and grimy. He let it drop. "And this is Maya." Sarah's gaze rested on Maya for a moment. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Hello, Maya. I like your robin." "His name is Pip," Maya said proudly. "He likes flying." "I'm sure he does," Sarah replied, and for the first time a hint of warmth entered her voice. She led them toward the living area, her movements graceful and contained. "I'll get you some blankets. And I suppose you're hungry." Leo opened his mouth to protest, to say they didn't want to be a burden, but his stomach chose that moment to rumble, a low, embarrassing growl in the cavernous silence. Sarah's lips twitched. "I'll take that as a yes. The kitchen is this way. Don't expect much. I'm not much of a cook." The kitchen was a chef's dream, a symphony of stainless steel, black marble, and high-tech appliances with glowing blue touchscreens. It was also completely spotless, as if it had never been used. Sarah opened a futuristic-looking refrigerator, its interior sparsely populated with bottles of sparkling water, a block of imported cheese, and a single perfect-looking green apple. She stared into it for a moment, a look of genuine confusion on her face. It was almost comical, this woman who lived in a palace of efficiency, utterly baffled by the simple task of feeding 2 people. She finally pulled out a carton of eggs and a loaf of artisanal bread. "Grilled cheese?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "It's about the extent of my culinary skills." "We love grilled cheese," Maya chirped, already climbing onto a sleek bar stool that looked more like a piece of sculpture than a place to sit. Leo watched Sarah work. Her movements were stiff, awkward. She handled the pan like it was a foreign object, buttered the bread with surgical precision but little confidence. She, who seemed so in control of her environment, was completely out of her element here. It was a small crack in her polished facade, and it made her, for the first time, seem human. He found himself wanting to step in, to take over, to show her the simple, messy rhythm of making a meal. But he stayed put, watching from the sidelines, an observer in her strange, sterile kingdom. The sandwiches, when they were done, were surprisingly perfect golden brown, with cheese melted just so. She served them on stark white plates, along with glasses of water. They ate in a silence that was less awkward than it was watchful. Leo was watching Sarah, and Sarah, he realized, was watching him and Maya. She watched the way he cut Maya's sandwich into triangles, the way Maya wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, the way they shared a look that needed no words. He could see the curiosity in her eyes, the quiet assessment of a life so different from her own. It was as if she were an anthropologist studying a newly discovered tribe. And in that moment, Leo understood. She wasn't just lonely, she was isolated, a queen in a glass castle, and she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone at her table. The storm raged outside, the wind howling a mournful song against the glass walls, but inside, a fragile quiet had settled. After they finished their sandwiches, Sarah led them to the fireplace. With a touch of a button on a remote, a line of fire danced to life along a bed of black stones. There was no crackle of wood, no scent of smoke, just a clean, silent flame that cast a warm, hypnotic glow across the room. She handed them thick, plush blankets that felt like woven clouds. Maya immediately curled up on the edge of the large leather couch, her eyelids already growing heavy. Leo sat at the other end, the blanket draped over his shoulders, a mug of tea Sarah had made cradled in his hands. It was some exotic blend he couldn't name, tasting of flowers and spice. Sarah took a seat in a sleek armchair across from him, her own mug held delicately in her hands. For a long time, they just watched the fire, the silence stretching between them. It should have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't. It was a shared stillness, a mutual pause. "She's not scared of much, is she?" Sarah said quietly, her gaze on Maya. Leo looked over at his daughter, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. A soft smile touched his lips. "No, she thinks everything is an adventure, even this." "She gets that from you," Sarah stated. Not as a question, but as a fact. Leo shook his head. "No, she gets that from her mother. I'm the worrier. She was the one who saw the good in everything. The mention of his wife hung in the air for a moment. He hadn't meant to bring her up, but it had slipped out, natural and true. Sarah didn't offer the usual empty condolences. She just watched him, her expression thoughtful. "What was she like?" she asked, her voice gentle. The question was direct, personal, but it didn't feel intrusive. It felt interested. Leo stared into the fire, the flames dancing like memories. "She was like sunlight," he said, the words coming easier than he expected. "She could make a home out of a drafty apartment and a feast out of a can of beans. She saw beauty in things I didn't even notice. A crack in the sidewalk, the way the light hit a dusty window. She used to say the world was full of little secrets. You just had to be quiet enough to hear them." He fell silent, the weight of the memory settling comfortably in his chest. It didn't hurt to talk about her tonight. Maybe it was the storm, or the fire, or the quiet presence of the woman across from him. "You miss her," Sarah said softly. "Every day," he replied without hesitation. "But I see her in Maya, in her laugh, in the way she's not afraid to get her hands dirty. That's how I know she's still here." He finally looked at Sarah. Her face was unreadable in the flickering light, but her eyes held a new softness, a depth he hadn't seen before. The cool, polished mask had slipped, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. "You don't talk like someone who just builds things with his hands," she observed. He shrugged. "My hands do the building. My heart does the feeling. Can't separate the two." A log, a fake one made of ceramic, shifted in the silent fire. Sarah looked away from him, back at the flames. "I used to think you could," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I used to think you had to." The conversation drifted after that, into easier, safer territory. He told her about his carpentry, the feel of shaping wood, of bringing something new into the world from something old. She spoke of architecture, not of the business of it, but of the theory of light and space, and how a building could shape the way a person felt. She spoke of it with a passion that was almost academic, a love for the idea of home, even if she didn't seem to know how to live in one. As the night deepened, he found himself relaxing in her presence. The immense, cold house started to feel smaller, warmer. The woman who had greeted them with an icy stare was now sharing a quiet corner of her world with him. He didn't know who she was, not really. He didn't know what brought a woman like her to a remote glass fortress on a mountaintop. But as he watched her watch the fire, her face etched with a loneliness that felt as vast as the valley outside her window, he felt an unexpected and dangerous pull, the desire to understand. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Serafina was hiding from something far more terrifying than the storm outside. The morning arrived, not with a bang, but with a hush. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and silent. A thick blanket of fresh snow covered everything, muffling sound and reflecting a brilliant, crystalline light that poured through the mansion's glass walls. Leo woke on the couch, the heavy blanket still draped over him, a crick in his neck. The fire was out. The house was still. He sat up, the events of the previous night feeling like a strange dream. For a moment, he thought they might have been alone, that their mysterious host had vanished like a ghost. But then the scent of coffee, rich and real, drifted in from the kitchen. He found Sarah standing by the counter, a French press in her hand. She was dressed in another simple but elegant outfit, and her hair was pulled back just as severely, but the tension in her shoulders was gone. She looked calmer. "Morning," she said, offering him a small smile. "There's coffee. And I think I found some oatmeal." "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "I did," she replied. Maya's still asleep. While Sarah prepared the oatmeal with the same focused, slightly clumsy determination as the grilled cheese, Leo stepped outside onto a vast stone patio. The air was frigid but clean, and the view was staggering. The fog had lifted, revealing a panoramic vista of snow-covered peaks and deep, emerald valleys stretching as far as the eye could see. The house was perched on the edge of a cliff, a modern eagle's nest overlooking the world. It was a billionaire's view, a king's view. It made him feel very small. Maya found him out there a few minutes later, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her wooden robin clutched in her hand. "Is this a magic house?" she asked, her voice full of awe. "Feels like it, doesn't it?" he said, pulling her close. They ate breakfast at the long marble island in the kitchen. The oatmeal was lumpy, but the coffee was the best Leo had ever tasted. As they ate, Maya, now fully awake and brimming with energy, began to explore. She didn't run or shout. She moved through the vast, open spaces with a kind of reverent curiosity, her small fingers tracing the lines of the furniture, her head tilted as she looked up at the high ceilings. Sira watched her, a fond, almost wistful expression on her face. Leo offered to wash the dishes, a simple gesture to repay her kindness. As he stood at the sink, which was large enough to be a bathtub, he noticed a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. It led to what looked like an office. While he was drying his hands, Maya wandered in that direction, drawn by the allure of a room she hadn't seen yet. He was about to call her back, but Sarah just gave a small shake of her head. "It's fine. There's nothing in there she can break." A moment later, Maya's voice echoed from the office. "Dad, come look! It's the lady from the house!" Leo exchanged a puzzled glance with Sarah. He walked down the hall and into the office. The room was as minimalist as the rest of the house, dominated by a single, massive desk made of reclaimed wood and a wall of built-in bookshelves. On the desk, propped against a sleek laptop, was a framed magazine cover. It was from a major architectural journal. The cover featured a stunning photograph of a woman standing in front of a futuristic skyscraper. The woman was Serafina. Her hair was styled differently. Her smile was polished and professional, but it was undeniably her. The headline read, "Serafina Vance, the visionary who redefined the skyline." And below that, a smaller line, "What's next for the architect who vanished?" Leo stared at the image, his mind struggling to connect the dots. Serafina Vance, he knew that name. She was a prodigy, a star in her field, famous for her groundbreaking sustainable designs. And then, about a year ago, she had disappeared from the public eye after a massive, bitter falling out with her business partner and a scandal that had rocked the industry. He looked from the magazine cover to the woman who was now standing in the doorway behind him, her face pale, her expression stripped bare. The pieces clicked into place: the remote mansion, the loneliness, the name she'd shortened. She hadn't just been hiding from the storm, she'd been hiding from the world. And they had just stumbled right into the heart of her sanctuary. The air in the office crackled with a new, sudden tension. The warmth of the morning, the easy camaraderie of breakfast, evaporated in an instant. Leo looked from the magazine cover back to Sarah, and the polite, gentle stranger from the night before was gone. In her place stood Serafina Vance, the architectural magnate, a woman whose world was built of things he couldn't possibly comprehend: fame, betrayal, and a level of wealth that was almost abstract. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The kindness she had shown them, the shelter, the food, it all felt different now, tainted by the massive, unspoken secret she had been keeping. Was this pity? A rich woman's brief, charitable interlude with the struggling masses? The thought was a bitter pill. He stepped back from the desk, unconsciously, putting a bit of distance between them. His posture straightened, his shoulders squaring in a defensive stance. He hadn't even realized he'd relaxed. "You're her," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth it had held just minutes before. Sarah didn't deny it. She couldn't. Her face was a mask of strained composure, but her eyes were a storm of conflicting emotions. "Leo," she started, her voice barely a whisper, "I was going to tell you." "Were you?" he countered, the question sharp. "When? After you'd finished studying us? After we provided a bit of rustic entertainment for your retreat?" The words were cruel, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop them. The feeling of being deceived, of being so out of his depth, was a raw and angry thing. He felt like a fool, a simple-minded carpenter who had mistaken a queen's passing glance for genuine connection. Maya, sensing the shift in the room, moved to stand by his side, her small hand slipping into his. She looked from his tense face to Sarah's pale one, her brow furrowed with confusion. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart," he said, but his tone was clipped. "We need to go. We've overstayed our welcome." He started to turn, to lead Maya out of the room, out of the house, back to the safety of their own simple, honest world. "Please don't," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" he shot back, turning to face her fully now. "You live in a glass house on top of a mountain, your face is on magazines, and you didn't think to mention it? You let us into your life under a false pretense." "It wasn't false," she insisted, taking a step forward. "My name is Sarah. This house is my home. Those are truths. The other stuff, the headlines, the company, that's the life I ran away from." "Right," he said, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. "You ran away to a fortress that probably costs more than my entire hometown. Forgive me if I don't see the hardship in that." He saw the hurt flash in her eyes, a direct hit. He had meant to wound, and he had succeeded. A part of him felt a grim satisfaction, the lashing out of a man who felt small and tricked. Another, deeper part of him ached at the sight of her pain. He was being unfair, reducing her to a headline just as he'd accused her of doing to him. But the wall was up now, built of pride and fear, and he didn't know how to take it down. "I need to fix my truck," he said, his voice cold and final. "Thank you for the shelter." He didn't wait for a reply. He took Maya's hand and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floors. He didn't look back, but he could feel her gaze on him, a silent, desperate plea, in a house that had suddenly become a prison for them both. The walk back to the truck was a silent, tense affair. The brilliant morning sun felt mocking, the snow-covered landscape too pristine for the ugly turn of events. Leo's mind was a whirlwind of anger, humiliation, and a confusing undercurrent of regret. He had been harsh, he knew that. He'd thrown her wealth in her face like an accusation. But her deception, however unintentional she claimed it was, felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust that had begun to form between them. How could he have been so naive? A woman like that didn't just stumble into the lives of men like him. There were always walls, always divides. He'd just been too tired and too hopeful to see the one she had built around herself. He reached the truck and immediately popped the hood, burying himself in the familiar world of grease and steel. It was a relief to focus on something tangible, something he could understand. A broken fuel line. A simple fix. He had the tools, he had the knowledge. This was a problem he could solve. He set to work with a furious energy, his movements sharp and efficient. He didn't want to be here a second longer than necessary. Every moment spent on her property felt like an indictment of his own foolishness. Maya sat on the tailgate, her legs dangling, the wooden robin held tightly in her lap. She was quiet, her usual stream of chatter silenced by the heavy tension. She watched him work, her eyes full of questions she seemed to know not to ask. He could feel her watching him, and it only fueled his desperate need to leave. About an hour into his work, he heard the soft crunch of boots on snow behind him. He didn't have to look up to know it was Sarah. He kept his head buried in the engine compartment, pretending he hadn't heard her. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice small, hesitant. "I'm fine," he said, his voice muffled by the engine block. He didn't want her help. He didn't want anything from her. He felt a presence beside him and glanced over. She was holding out a thermos. "I brought you some coffee." He straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the thermos, then at her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression fragile. The anger in his chest warred with a pang of something else, something he didn't want to name. "I don't need your coffee," he said, the words colder than he intended. She flinched, but she didn't retreat. She set the thermos on the truck's bumper. "It's not a peace offering," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "It's just coffee. It's cold out here. You've been working for an hour." He stared at her, the silence stretching. He wanted to tell her to go, to leave him alone. But he couldn't. Because beneath the anger, beneath the pride, he saw the woman from the night before, the lonely, isolated person who was just as trapped as he was, albeit in a much fancier cage. He let out a long, slow breath and picked up the thermos. He didn't thank her. He just poured a cup and took a sip, the warmth spreading through him, doing little to thaw the ice that had formed around his heart. They stood there in silence, a gulf of misunderstanding and unspoken truths between them, the steam from his coffee, the only thing bridging the gap. The fuel line was fixed. The engine turned over on the first try, a low, steady rumble that was the most beautiful sound Leo had heard all day. It meant freedom. It meant escape. He closed the hood with a satisfying thud and wiped the last of the grease from his hands. It was time to go. Sarah stood a few yards away, near the edge of the woods, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She hadn't said another word since he'd taken the coffee. She just watched, her face a pale, sad mask. Leo walked to the passenger side and opened the door for Maya. "All right, kiddo, let's hit the road." Maya slid off the tailgate, but she didn't get in the truck. Instead, she walked over to Sarah. Leo's heart clenched. "Maya, come on!" But his daughter ignored him. She stopped in front of Sarah and held out the small, carved wooden robin. "This is for you," she said, her voice clear and steady. Sarah looked down at the bird, then at Maya, her expression confused. "I can't take Pip," she said softly. "He's yours." "He needs to stay here," Maya insisted. "This is a lonely castle. He can be its friend. He'll sing for you when we're gone." A single tear escaped and traced a path down Sarah's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She knelt down, her eyes level with Maya's, and gently took the small bird from her outstretched hand. Her fingers brushed Maya's, and the contact seemed to ground her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll take very good care of him." Maya gave her a quick, fierce hug, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated affection that seemed to shatter the last of Sarah's composure. She held on to the little girl for a long moment, her eyes closed. Leo stood by the truck, a spectator to this quiet, heartbreaking exchange. He felt a lump form in his throat. His daughter, with her boundless empathy, had just done what he could not. She had seen past the walls, past the wealth, and offered a simple, unconditional gift. She had offered kindness. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the still mountain air. "Maya, we have to go." She pulled away from Sarah and ran to the truck, climbing inside without a word. Leo closed her door and walked around to the driver's side. He didn't look at Sarah as he got in. He put the truck in gear, his hands tight on the wheel. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Sarah was still kneeling in the snow, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand, watching them go. He drove down the long, winding driveway, away from the glass house, away from the woman who was more mystery than he could handle. He didn't look back again, but the image of her, alone in the snow, was burned into his mind. The silence in the truck was a living thing. The miles spooled out behind them, each one putting more distance between them and the glass mansion on the mountain. But the tension didn't ease. Leo kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, replaying the morning's events over and over. He'd been defensive, angry, cruel. He'd let his own insecurities and pride poison a moment of genuine human connection. He had judged her, reduced her to her wealth, and walked away. He glanced over at Maya. She was staring out the window, her reflection a faint, sad ghost on the glass. She hadn't said a word since they left. "Are you mad at me?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, not looking at him. "No." "Then what is it?" "She was sad, Daddy," Maya said, her voice small. "You made her sadder." The simple, unvarnished truth hit him like a physical blow. He had, in his haste to protect himself, to reassert his own dignity. He had trampled on hers. He had seen her vulnerability and used it as a weapon. "Sometimes grown-ups get things wrong, honey," he said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "Even me." "You can fix it," she said, finally turning to look at him, her eyes wide and earnest. "You can go back." "We can't go back, Maya," he said, his voice firm. "We have to keep moving forward. We have that job waiting, remember?" But even as he said it, the words tasted like a lie. The job. The apartment they felt 1,000,000 miles away, pale and insignificant compared to the raw, unfinished business he'd left behind on that mountain. The rest of the day was a blur of winding roads and silent landscapes. They stopped once for gas and sandwiches at a roadside diner that smelled of stale coffee and fried onions. They ate without talking, the space between them filled with the things they weren't saying. That night, they pulled into a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with flickering neon signs and threadbare carpets. As Leo unlocked the door to their room, a wave of weariness washed over him, so profound it almost buckled his knees. The room was small, impersonal, smelling faintly of bleach. It was another temporary stop in a life that had become a series of them. As Maya got ready for bed, Leo sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and pulled out his wallet. Tucked in the back was the crumpled receipt from the diner, a reminder of their dwindling funds. He thought of Sarah's kitchen, of the silent, perfect fire, of the view from her patio. He had run from that world, so determined to prove he didn't need it, that he belonged somewhere else. But sitting here, in this drab, transient room, he was forced to confront a difficult truth. He hadn't just run from her wealth. He had run from the hope she represented. The hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't destined to be alone, fighting a losing battle against a world that didn't care. He had run because he was scared. Scared of what it would mean to let someone in again. Scared of what it would mean to lose them. He lay awake for hours that night, long after Maya's soft breathing had filled the room, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The image of Sarah kneeling in the snow, clutching that small wooden bird, wouldn't leave him. He hadn't just left a woman on a mountain, he'd left a piece of himself there, too. 2 weeks later, they were in a different state, a different town, but the feeling was the same. The job had fallen through. The guarantee had turned out to be a vague promise from a foreman who'd overhired and was now making cuts. Leo found himself in a town called Rock Creek, taking on odd jobs from a bulletin board at the local hardware store, fixing a leaky faucet, building a set of shelves, patching a fence. It was enough to pay for another week at another motel, enough to keep food on the table, but it was a hand-to-mouth existence that was wearing him down to the bone. His hands, which had once found joy in the creation of beautiful things, now just felt tired. The spark was gone. He was going through the motions, a hollowed-out version of the man he used to be. Maya was resilient, as always. She found adventures in the motel's tiny swimming pool and made friends with the stray cat that hung around the ice machine. But Leo saw the change in her too. She drew more pictures of mountains and glass houses. She talked about Pip, the wooden robin, as if he were off on an important mission. She never mentioned Sarah by name, but she was there, a quiet, constant presence in their lives. One afternoon, while Leo was sanding a set of kitchen cabinets for a woman on the other side of town, Maya was sitting at the motel room's small desk, humming and drawing. The motel manager, a kind, grandmotherly woman named Carol, knocked on the door. "Special delivery." "For a Miss Maya," she said, holding out a large, flat cardboard box. Maya's eyes went wide. The box had no return address, just her name and the motel's address printed in neat, elegant block letters. Leo, who had just returned, stood in the doorway, his heart beginning to pound. Together, they opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was the most beautiful, intricate dollhouse Leo had ever seen. It was a perfect, miniature replica of Sarah's glass and steel mansion. Every detail was there: the stone patio, the wall of windows, the minimalist furniture. And in the very center of the tiny living room, sitting on a minuscule leather couch, was a small, perfectly carved wooden robin. Tucked beside it was a small, folded note. Maya picked it up and read it aloud, her voice soft. "Every castle needs a friend, and every friend needs a home. Keep building beautiful things. S." Leo sank onto the edge of the bed, the scent of sawdust on his clothes mingling with the sudden, sharp scent of regret. It wasn't a gift of pity, it was a message. A quiet, beautifully crafted acknowledgement of their shared moment. It was a bridge, extended across miles of silence and misunderstanding. He looked at Maya, her face alight with a joy he hadn't seen in weeks. She was already arranging the tiny furniture, her imagination taking flight. And Leo knew, with a painful, gut-wrenching certainty, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had let his pride and fear dictate his choices, and in doing so, he had walked away from the one person who had seen him not as a project, not as a charity case, but as a man who built beautiful things. The dollhouse sat in the corner of their motel room like a silent testament. For days, Leo couldn't stop looking at it. It was more than a gift. It was a piece of her, a tangible representation of the world he had so hastily rejected. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, something he, as a carpenter, could deeply appreciate. The tiny joints, the perfectly scaled furniture, the way the light caught the miniature glass wall-sit spoke of patience, of care, of a deep and profound understanding of what he valued. It was an apology and an olive branch, all without a single word of either. He started seeing her everywhere. In the clean lines of a modern building downtown. In the determined look of a woman striding purposefully into an office. In the quiet solitude of the early morning light. The anger he had clung to had long since dissolved, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of regret. He had let his own baggage, his own fear of being seen as less than, cloud his judgment. She had tried to connect with him, and he had thrown it back in her face. One evening, after Maya had fallen asleep, her head pillowed next to the miniature mansion, Leo found himself online. He didn't search for Serafina Vance. He already knew that story. Instead, he typed in the name of the architectural journal from her office. He found her old interviews, articles she'd written not about business, but about the philosophy of space, about creating structures that breathed with the landscape. He read about her passion for sustainable materials, for creating homes that were sanctuaries, not just status symbols. He read about the betrayal by her partner, who had taken her designs and cheapened them for mass production, slapping her name on projects she would have never approved. The scandal wasn't that she'd failed, it was that she'd walked away from a corrupted version of her own dream, rather than compromise her integrity. The woman he'd met wasn't a spoiled heiress hiding from a tantrum. She was a brilliant artist who had been deeply wounded and had retreated to the only place she felt safe, a house she had built with her own two hands, a house that was a perfect, beautiful, and lonely expression of her soul. He closed the laptop, the glow of the screen fading in the dark room. He looked at the dollhouse, then at his own calloused hands. She wasn't just a woman who lived in a glass house. She was the one who had built it. And he, a man who prided himself on understanding the heart of a builder, had failed to see it. The ache in his chest sharpened into a clear, undeniable resolve. He had to go back. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know if she would even see him, but he had to try. He had to fix what he had broken. The decision to go back was one thing. The reality of it was another. The trip had cost them nearly everything they had. The journey back would require a miracle. Leo spent the next 2 days taking on every small, grueling job he could find. He worked from sunup to sundown, his body aching but his purpose renewed. He fixed gutters, hung drywall, repaired a set of creaking stairs, his hands moving with a speed and precision he hadn't felt in months. The spark was back, fueled by a desperate hope. He sold his best tools, the ones he'd inherited from his own father, keeping only the essentials. It was a painful sacrifice, like selling a part of his own history, but it was necessary. The money, combined with his earnings, was just enough. He told Maya they were going on another adventure. "A different one this time," he said. "We're going to go return something." Her eyes lit up. The dollhouse? No, he said, smiling. Something more important. The drive back was a pilgrimage. The miles felt different this time, not like an escape, but like a journey home. They didn't stop at cheap motels. They drove through the night, taking turns, sleeping in the truck, pushing forward with a shared, unspoken urgency. As they climbed back into the mountains, the landscape growing familiar, Leo felt his heart pound in his chest. What if she wasn't there? What if she'd moved on, disappeared again? What if she saw him and shut the door in his face? He deserved it, he knew. He pulled into the unmarked gravel driveway, his tires crunching on the familiar stones. The house stood as it had before, a silent, modern marvel against the rugged backdrop of the mountains. But this time, it didn't look cold or intimidating. It looked like a sanctuary. He parked the truck, his hands shaking slightly. He took a deep breath. "Stay here for a minute, okay, kiddo?" Maya nodded, her eyes wide. Leo got out of the truck and walked to the massive front door. He raised his hand, his heart in his throat, and knocked. The silence that followed was deafening. He waited 1 minute, then 2. No answer. A wave of despair washed over him. He had come all this way, sacrificed everything, and he was too late. He was about to turn away when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small, winding stone path that led from the side of the house down a gentle slope, disappearing into a grove of birch trees. On a whim, a last, desperate gamble, he followed it. The path opened into a small, hidden clearing, and there she was. Sarah was on her knees in a patch of dirt, a small garden she seemed to be trying to reclaim from the wild earth. Her hair was messy, a few loose strands sticking to her forehead. She wore old jeans stained with mud and a simple t-shirt. She looked nothing like the magnate on the magazine cover, and everything like the woman he'd shared a quiet conversation with by the fire. She was so absorbed in her work, trying to coax a small, struggling seedling from the soil, that she didn't hear him approach. In her hands, he saw she was using a small, handcrafted wooden trowel, something clearly not bought from a store. Standing next to her, stuck into the soft earth, was the little wooden robin, Pip. He had found his home. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "you'll have better luck if you loosen the soil around the roots first." Sarah froze. For a long second, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes widened, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She just stared at him as if he were a ghost, a figment of her lonely imagination. He took a few steps closer, his boots sinking into the soft earth. I was wrong," he said, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. "About everything. I was scared, and I was a jerk. I let my own pride get in the way of seeing what was right in front of me." Sarah slowly got to her feet, brushing the dirt from her hands. She still hadn't spoken, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand. "I saw what you did," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "The articles, the real story. And the dollhouse. Sarah, the dollhouse was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." He took another step, closing the distance between them. "I came back because a lonely castle isn't a home. And I've been living in one too. A different kind, but just as empty. And I don't want to be anymore." A tear traced a path through the smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Leo," she whispered, the name a breath of sound. "What I said to you, in the office. That was my fear talking," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not my heart." "My heart, well, my heart is telling me I was an idiot to walk away from you." The corner of her mouth twitched, the first hint of a smile. "You were," she agreed softly. He let out a laugh, a sound of pure relief. "I know." "I didn't think you'd come back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I'd ruined it." "You can't ruin something that's real," he said, echoing the words he'd realized were the core of it all. "And this," he gestured between them, to the house, to the small, struggling garden. "This feels more real than anything I've known in a long time." He reached out, his calloused hand gently brushing the dirt from her cheek. The touch was electric, a current of unspoken feelings passing between them. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "An old truck, a handful of tools, a daughter who thinks you're a queen." "You have everything to offer," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "You offer honesty. You offer kindness. You offer a home." At that moment, a small voice called out from the top of the path. "Daddy?" They both turned. Maya stood there, a hopeful, hesitant smile on her face. Sarah's face broke into a radiant grin. She looked back at Leo, her eyes shining. "Well," she said, "are you going to invite us in for lunch?" "I think I've finally figured out how to make oatmeal without lumps." Leo laughed, a full, genuine sound that echoed through the quiet clearing. He took Sarah's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "I think," he said, "we'd like that very much." The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rediscovery. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic shifts, just a slow and steady weaving together of two vastly different lives. Leo and Maya moved into one of the mansion's spare rooms, a space that Sarah had painstakingly softened with warmer colors, comfortable, non-designer furniture, and a bookshelf she'd filled with every children's classic she could find. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, an admission that her sterile, minimalist fortress needed the messy, vibrant clutter of life. Leo found his rhythm in the vast, unused workshop at the back of the property. It was filled with state-of-the-art equipment that he initially regarded with suspicion, but soon grew to love. He started building again, not just for money, but for the joy of it. He built Maya a new bed frame, carved with intricate vines and birds. He built a sturdy dining table for the kitchen, a piece of warm, solid oak that instantly made the cavernous room feel more like a place for family. He was teaching Sarah how to use a sander, her brow furrowed in concentration as she learned the feel of the wood, the patience required to smooth a rough edge. She, in turn, was teaching him about things he'd never considered. She showed him how the passive solar design of the house worked, how it captured the sun's warmth. She spread blueprints across the new dining table, explaining her vision for a community of affordable, sustainable homes, a project she'd abandoned after her partner's betrayal. He saw the passion ignite in her eyes as she spoke, and he realized her dream wasn't about building monuments to herself, it was about building sanctuaries for others. Maya was the bridge that connected all their separate islands. She filled the house's silent halls with laughter. She left crayon drawings on the marble countertops. She insisted they have picnics on the living room floor. She dragged Sarah out into the garden every day, and together they coaxed the stubborn earth to life. They planted wildflowers and herbs, their hands covered in the same rich soil, their shared laughter the only sound in the quiet mountain air. There were moments of friction, of course. He was a man used to scarcity, who reused tea bags and saved every scrap of wood. She was a woman who had never had to think about a budget, who would casually order a $500 tool when a $50 one would do. They navigated these differences with a careful, gentle honesty, learning each other's languages. He taught her the value of mending what was broken. She taught him it was okay to accept a gift, that not all help came with strings attached. One evening, they were sitting on the patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Maya was chasing fireflies on the lawn. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, her voice quiet, "about the community project. My old plans." "They're brilliant," Leo said, meaning it. "I know," she said with a small smile, "but they're missing something." She turned to him, her eyes serious. "They're missing you. Your hands. Your understanding of what makes a house a home. It's not just about clean lines and energy efficiency. It's about the feel of a solid door, the warmth of a wooden floor. It's about heart." "Sarah," he started, a familiar wave of caution washing over him. "I'm not asking you to be my employee, Leo," she said, cutting him off gently. "I'm asking you to be my partner. In this, in everything." He looked at her, at the woman who had everything and nothing, who had found him at his lowest and shown him what it meant to be seen. He looked at his daughter, a silhouette of pure joy against the fading light. He looked at the home they were slowly, messily, beautifully building together. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He took her hand, his calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. "Okay," he said. "Let's build something beautiful." The autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the valley. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and decaying leaves. On the patio of the glass house, a small group of people was gathered. Not investors or reporters, but friends. Carol, the motel manager, was there, along with a few of the families Leo had done work for in Rock Creek. They were a motley, cheerful crew, their easy laughter a warm and welcome sound against the modern architecture. Leo stood at the head of the oak table he had built, a carving knife in his hand. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting on the small of his back. Maya sat between them, her feet not quite touching the ground, a crown of autumn leaves perched on her head. In the center of the table was not a catered feast, but a collection of potluck dishes, a testament to a community being built, one casserole at a time. This was the official launch of their new venture, the Vance Morgan Initiative. It wasn't a splashy corporate entity. It was a small foundation dedicated to building sustainable, affordable, and beautiful homes for families in need. Sarah provided the architectural genius and the funding. Leo provided the craftsmanship, the heart, and the grounding reality of what a family truly needed to thrive. He raised his glass of apple cider. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice steady, "but I've learned a few things this past year. I've learned that a home isn't about the size of the walls but about the people you share it with. And I've learned that the strongest foundations aren't made of concrete, but of kindness." He looked at Sarah, his eyes full of a love that was quiet, deep, and unshakable. "And I've learned that sometimes getting lost is the only way to find out exactly where you're supposed to be." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, her own glass raised. The guests cheered, a warm and genuine sound. Later, as the sun dipped below the peaks, Leo and Sarah stood by the railing, watching Maya teach the other kids how to make a perfect paper airplane. The little wooden robin, Pip, sat on the railing between them, a silent, watchful guardian of their unlikely love story. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her. "More than I ever thought I could be," she whispered. She looked around, at the house that was no longer a cage but a home, at the people who filled its silence with joy, at the man who had shown her that her greatest strength wasn't in the things she built, but in the love she was brave enough to let in. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the sound of children's laughter. It was a messy, imperfect, and breathtakingly beautiful life. And it was just the beginning.